And while we're still in a meditative mode, let's spend just a few minutes cultivating bodhicitta, motivation, grounded in great love and great compassion. Cultivate bodhicitta, for this day and also for the time together. So, yeah, so just let's take a few minutes to cultivate bodhicitta. So then with with bodhicitta in our minds and hearts, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. For the recording, I was trying to adjust the settings. Good to see everybody. So in in our text by Kachin Yeshi Gelson, right? We're up to, for those who are following along, we're on page 63. And so we're we've covered now most of the so we're on the sixth of the six root mental afflictions, right? So we've covered, like, actually we've covered we finished those section on the virtuous states of mind, and now we're on the sixth root of mental afflictions, and then we'll do the 20 secondary mental afflictions. And of the six, we've covered 5 out of the 6, and last time we started the 6th, which is called, and the 6th is called afflicted views, and there are 5 of them. And the one we covered last time was the view of the transitory of those 6 afflicted views. We already covered the first, which is the view of the transitory collection here, right? Which is again, I thought that was quite fun when the author says, he'll repeat this phrase, but it is an endurance, a desire, an intelligence, a conception, or a view. In this case, that views what the perishable collection is, the 5 aggregates, right, which are impermanent, changing instant by instant. And so it's a view grasping at an I or a mind on those 5, or in those 5 aggregates. Truly exist. Well, actually, there are different. At one point, with the view of the transitory collection, actually, each of the different tenet systems would define that one slightly differently. So like, I just said truly existent, for example. That would only be a Majjhimaka. Other tenet systems would refute a substantially existent self-exist. Anyway, you could. So the view of the transitory collection we've already covered, though, and the others are going to be based on that, because we already said this, right? The view of the transitory collection is the basis for all other views, ignorance. But okay, so on page 63, the next one is holding to an extreme view, or other translates the same thing. The view that grasps. I guess holding, sometimes they translate that grasping. So holding or grasping at an extreme view. We can just read we'll start with what he actually says, and we can just kind of explain. So the author says, what is holding to an extreme? And then again, he says, it is any endurance, desire, intelligence, conception, or view which views the 5 appropriated aggregates as being either permanent or annihilated. It has the function of hindering definite emergence by means of the middle path. So there's a lot in that short definition. So one point is, I'll just go back, is he says, again, this is going to come up again and again, right? Where he says it could be an endurance, a desire, an intelligence, a conception, or a view. And in the previous section on the review of the transitory collection, he elaborated on those. So he's not going to keep elaborating on them. So you can go back and remember why it lists all of those. But I had said last time I thought it was quite funny. The first of them, endurance, right? Because that's like that we have an infinite patience or endurance for our own wrong views. We've nourished them since beginningless time. So it's an endurance in the sense that we're patient with our own ignorance. It's a desire because we seek an erroneous object and so on. It's all there. I think even the word intelligence is kind of funny, isn't it? It's an intelligence that's a wrong intelligence. So it's like it's an intelligence that grasps something that doesn't exist and so on. So those terms, there's a lot to think about with those, but we already talked about them, so I'm not going to cover them again. But they're listed here, right? And then it says, which views the 5 appropriated aggregates. So again, one point that's being implied here is that, well, he says it just below. He says, just as has been said above, is an afflicted wisdom. Again, I think that's a funny phrase, right? Afflicted wisdom, right? So it's like an intelligence that's wrong, in other words, which observes the self. Now, this is important because this is what's getting at by the above, where it says, which observes the self that is held by the view of the transitory collection, right? So this wrong view, or not wrong view, this afflicted view, which holds to an extreme, arises from the view of the transitory collection, right? So in other words, its object of observation is that non-existent self, right? So it's looking at the non-existent self that's grasped at by the view of the transitory collection. And here it apprehends that self to be either permanent or annihilated. And I'll explain that in a second. And one point that's made in one of the commentaries is it can actually be a full-blown grasping at a kind of permanent or annihilation, nihilism, you could say permanence or nihilism, or it could be something that leans in that direction, right? So it could be a view that's leaning in the direction of nihilism or leaning in the direction of eternalism, of permanence. And either way, that it becomes a view grasping at an extreme. So you get the idea that it's based upon the object of observation of this mind is that view of the transitory collection, is that self, a true self existing on the 5 aggregates, the self-existent self there. And then in this case, it views that as permanent or annihilated. So what does that mean? We'll keep going. So it says here, now he quotes Lama Tsongkhapa in the great Lamrim, Great Stages of the Path, great exposition of the stages of the path. So it says, the view holding to an extreme is an afflicted wisdom which observes the self that is held by the view of the transitory collection, right? Again, so that's its object that it's looking at. And it views it as either being permanent in the sense of being unchanging, or as being annihilated in the sense of not transmigrating to a future life after this life. So here, Lama Tsongkhapa is expounding to kind of explain what is, so the view of permanence would be, right, it's permanent, it says permanent in the sense of being unchanging, right? So it holds that self to be something, a personal identity, you could say it this way, it grasps with that view of self, and it views it as something unchanging, which even after death will continue on forever. And actually, people have this view, don't they? Like, in other words, as if there's a kind of permanent identity that will continue forever. One point is, like, we sometimes do that even in a very simplistic way, right? When we think back to our early in our life, right? And then we think later and we imagine we'll be the same. But of course, we're not the same, right? We change, in other words, moment by moment. And sometimes we project that. In this case, it's saying, the commentaries say permanent in the sense of unchanging. So sometimes also people do that where they, oh gosh, it's like people have this fantasy, right, where they like imagine like actually in oh gosh, in like movies. Sometimes it's like that. There are certain ideas where people see, like, they imagine after death, right, that they'll meet all their loved ones and everybody will look the same, right? As if people will be in heaven, they'll all look the way they looked, and they'll all have the same personality, and they'll all have the same, as if there is a, what that's missing is there never was that, right? There was the view of the transitory collection is pointing out there never was a stable, permanent personal identity. Even in this life, there certainly isn't going to be one after death. In other words, our identity changes instant by instant, right? Or actually, our aggregates change instant by instant. And what we label the aggregates on changes instant by instant. But here, this view of permanence so it's a reification. It's a kind of creating of, one has already reified a self on the transitory collection, and here one kind of reifies a view that self is permanent and unchanging, and that it will always be, So that's that. So that's that extreme. And the other extreme Lama Tsongkhapa mentions here is annihilated in the sense of not transmigrating to a future life after this life. So actually, that view actually is quite common in our culture, isn't it? Like that, and there's the first one. Actually, they're both common. So one would be, this one would actually, if you like one. So the first one, right, is this fantasy. It's often reflective. I'm just giving an example, right, where people imagine, oh, when I die, I'll see everyone I loved, and they'll look just like they looked, and I'll look like I looked, except maybe better and younger and healthier, and then they'll all look, even though grandma was sick and elderly and her body was falling apart, she'll suddenly look like she did at whatever age, and you make up an age, right? As if there's some kind of permanent thing there that can just look and be, and somehow would be that and unchanged. Actually, it wasn't even that in that life, right? But one can project that. And then the annihilated, in the sense of not transmigrating, that afflicted view actually is quite common, right? It's the one, one example in our culture would be, oh, well, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of neurological firings, and as soon as the brain stops, there will be nothing, absolutely nothing, right? The illusion of consciousness will end, and there will be nothing there at all, right? And so there's no past life and no future life. There's nothing, it's just end. So that would be an example of that afflicted view. And in ancient India, there were people who had that view, some very similar view to that, and it's the same. There've always been people with that view, I suppose, and that would be nihilism from this perspective, right? So Buddhists would view the one as a kind of eternalism or a view of permanence, and the other as annihilation or a view of nihilism. And now those are what those views are. And then it says in the definition, right, it has the function of hindering definite emergence. So that's renunciation, right, by means of the middle path. So and the middle path is, Vasubandhu points out, the middle path, the middle way, or the middle path, means the knowledge of dependent origination that shuns grasping at extinction, at nihilism and permanence. So what is it saying? It's saying a few things. One is it's saying, if you hold to such a view, definite emergence is renunciation. It's another translation of that term, right? Sometimes they translate it as renunciation, sometimes it's translated as death. So it's the wish to definitely emerge from suffering, right? So one point they're making is, if you have a view of permanence or a view of nihilism, then you're not going to develop the wish for liberation, right? That's what it's pointing at. And why won't you? Because actually, if you view the self as permanent, then you think it's unchanging. So the idea of some kind of liberation is silly, isn't it? Whereas the self is already what it is, and it's unchanging, so there's nothing to change about it. So you would just sort of not do anything. And if you have a nihilistic view, then there's no need for seeking liberation, because you think nothing is real, and you're going to be nothing at the time of death anyway. So what's the difference? So in those two cases, you wouldn't. Actually, there are obstacles to. So you say it right. There are actually obstacles, even there are obstacles to definite emergence. There are even obstacles to ethics, aren't they? Whereas if you think you'll come to nothing, and essentially are nothing, which of course, your idea of nothing is something, it's an idea, but if one grasps some idea of nothingness and then says that's the nature of what I'll be, which in some sense implies that's what I already am, then there's no actual reason to engage in ethics, is there? There's no reason to strive for liberation. And the same idea applies to permanence, right? In other words, if you think there's some kind of permanent self that's unchanging and will always be unchanging, then how, then it's unchanging, so it can't be liberated, or it already is liberated. But either way, there's no path to practice from those perspectives. And also, it says here, it's the principal obstacle progressing on the middle path, free of these extremes, right? And so the idea here, I just want to point out, is that if one, and let me go back to the the phrase holding or grasping. So if one holds and grasps at such a view, then one won't explore dependent origination, right? And what Buddhism is suggesting is that things are dependently arisen, right? And what Buddhism is saying is something that's dependently arisen, first of all, is obviously not permanent in the sense of unchanging, because it's dependent, right? And that which is dependent is impermanent and relies upon causes and conditions, so it's not permanent. And also that which is dependently arisen doesn't become nothing, right? Because it serves as, other things arise from it. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, if something's dependently arisen, it's both an effect, it's relative, right? It's relative to that which came before it, it's an effect. Relative to that which will become later, it's a cause, right? So it's part of an interdependent process. And so part of the point here is, if you're grasping at these extremes, then you won't explore the nature of dependent arising. And it's dependent arising that frees us from the views of eternalism and nihilism, right? Dependent arising implies that things are not permanent, but that they also don't, they aren't ever intrinsically annihilated. There's things end, they're impermanent, but they don't end in some intrinsic way that's an absolute end. They're part of a process of interdependence and dependent arising. So that's that's why this is one of the afflicted views. That's one of the root mental afflictions, is it blocks you, right? If you grasp at if you already, we all have the view of the perishable collection, right? The first of these, which is an obstacle to spiritual liberation, because it's ignorance that serves as the cause of samsara. This is an elaboration on that's worse in a way, right? There's this one. You not only have the view of the perishable collection, which we've had since beginning of this time, we'll have until we see emptiness directly, or until we realize emptiness. But here, with this view of holding to an extreme, one either denigrates and says there's no, the self ends absolutely, or one reifies in a way that blocks one from actually engaging in spiritual practice, meaningful spiritual practice of the path. So that's, so you see so it's like an elaboration of the first that has either of these two qualities. So an extreme in the sense of the two extremes, right? And the middle path in Buddhism is the path between those two extremes. So that's not nihilism and that's not eternalism, you could say. I'll pause there. I think that one's fairly straightforward. But any questions about it? The next of these 5 afflicted views is, let's read here, the conception of a bad view as supreme. So regarding the conception of a bad view as supreme, the Compendium of Knowledge says, what is the conception of a bad view as supreme? And then it says again, it is any endurance, desire, intelligence, conception, or view which views themselves, right? And the locus of views, which is the 5 appropriate aggregates, to be supreme, to be chief, to be superior, and to be excellent. It has the function of acting as a support for strongly adhering to bad views. So just keep going as he elaborates a bit, and then I'll explain. So he says, just as has been said above, it is an afflicted wisdom that observes other bad views and the aggregates, the locus and dependence upon which they arise, right? So bad views arise in dependence upon the aggregates. And that's going back to this point, right? That the view of the transitory collection, that there's an appearance of the aggregates. We, with an afflicted wisdom, we, in the view of the perishable collection, we reify a self as existing on those aggregates or in those aggregates, right? And then, and here, based on either a view in relation to the aggregates or based on the aggregates themselves, we hold that as supreme. So either the aggregates or a view, we hold it as supreme. Here, supreme and so forth in the citation above are explained as follows. So it is conceded about them being marvelous. It holds them as supreme, since it holds that there is none more outstanding than them. It holds them to be chief. It holds them to be superior to others. Since it holds there is none equal to them, it holds them to be excellent. So I just want to pause here and we'll keep going in a second. What this is getting at, I'm going to use the example of views, right? Like so I'm going to use let's go back to the, we'll use the example of an extreme, right? Holding to an extreme, right? So like, let's say a person has a view of nihilism, right? I'm giving examples. This is a view, right? The view of nihilism, that there's no, what's the word say, right? That at the time of death, you'll be nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. Nothing will continue. And therefore, what you do doesn't matter. That's a view, right? On the one hand, what a person might just hold that view. Like, in other words, they might be their culture, they might have that view and kind of think, yeah, that seems right. I don't know. Like, here one adds to that. One thinks, that's right, and anybody else, and actually one thinks something like this. That's right, and anyone who doesn't understand that is an idiot. They're so stupid, how could they not recognize that? That view is the best, right? And then somebody else who has the view of eternalism, right? There's a difference between sort of somebody, say, there's a difference between just having the view of eternal, like the example I gave earlier. Oh, when you die, you'll look like you did when you were when you were at your best, and you'll see everybody else as they were. There's one thing to have that view where you think, well, like, you're grieving and you think, oh, well, that's what it'll be like, and I feel soothed. Okay, well, that's having that view. Here, it goes beyond that, right? The viewing it as supreme. It's where you here it is. There's nothing superior to this, right? So again, you think, wow, everybody else is an idiot who doesn't understand that that'll be that way. And this is the best of all views. This is, this is absolutely correct, and every other view is totally wrong. So it could, in my example here, where it's views, right? It would be, so one person might grasp at the view of permanence, another might grasp at a view of nihilism. Here it goes beyond grasping to asserting that view is perfect, that view is, as he says here, is supreme, is chief, is superior to all others, and is excellent, right? There's no other view as good as that. So with this phenomena, again, there's a grasping at a wrong, in this case, a wrong view as an example I'm giving. But then it goes beyond that to, with great confidence, asserting that wrong view is the supreme, is the best, is absolutely true. And now Lama Tsongkhapa elaborates a bit more. So our author quotes Lama Tsongkhapa's Lama Chenmo, the Great Exposition, Stages of the Path, where it says, the conception of a bad view as supreme is an afflicted wisdom which observes any of the three. So it could be the view of the transitory collection, the view holding to an extreme, or a wrong view, and the aggregates of the viewer in dependence upon which the above three views arise, and hold them to be supreme. Right. So in this case, Lama Tsongkhapa is going into a little more detail. So you're viewing, if one is holding to this kind of conception of a bad view as supreme, it says here, and. So one is looking at one's own aggregates in this case, and at a wrong view associated with them, or an afflicted view associated with them. And he gives three examples. It could be the view of the transitory collection. It could be the view holding to an extreme, which we just mentioned. Or it could be a wrong view, which is coming later in this list. and it holds that to be supreme, right? And you get the idea. So there's like a, what's the word? There's a confidence in the wrong view, in the afflicted view. There's a elevating it. And what he's pointing out here, there are a couple of things here. One is, to the extent that one has this, one is not open to questions, is one point, right? One isn't open to questioning that. And also, he points out here, its function is specified as acting as a support for strongly adhering to wrong views, because it deposits imprints for not separating from bad views in this life and future lives. So now what he's saying is this, is when you hold an afflicted view as supreme, you won't, one point is, he's making two different points here. One is, it creates imprints to not separate from it in this life, right? Because if you hold an afflicted view as supreme, as the best, as excellent, as chief, whatever, all these different terms you use, then you won't question it, right? And if somebody else questions it, you may actually find, you'll get mad at them, for example, and so on. But you know, or you'll pity them or whatever. But so one is, it's a kind of closed-mindedness, right? It leads to a kind of closed-minded approach. And what it's saying is the karmic result of that also is that you'll hold to whatever that view is again in future lifetimes, right? Because you view it as the best. So you kind of create a kind of karmic tendency to very strongly adhere to that view. Yeah, so that, and that's, and what he's getting at in a way is that you know, from a Buddhist perspective, in terms of progressing on the path, that will block you in this life and future lives from practicing the path, right? Because you have a kind of karmic tendency to very strongly adhere to a certain kind of view that's not accurate. It's just making me, I won't go far in this, but it's reminded me one, I remember many years ago, when it was one of the earliest Mind and Life meetings, and it was at, I remember I was there, it was at MIT. I don't know if it was an actual Mind and Life or it was like before the Mind and Life was, it was just starting, but it was like, I can't remember now, but the Dalai Lama was there at MIT with these professors, and this one MIT professor, like in a kind of I would call it like a belittling way, said like it was obvious that consciousness was just was just sort of a result of neuronal firing, and there was no such thing as actual consciousness, and there'd be nothing at the time of death. And he kind of said it in a very arrogant way. And I remember, like, you could tell in his demeanor, I could tell, it felt to me like he was expecting the Dalai Lama, to kind of be upset by that. And instead, the Dalai Lama started saying, well, have you experimented on that? Like, have you done scientific experiments to prove that? And the guy kind of like looked like, what are you talking about? Like, that wasn't the response he expected. And he said, like, and the guy, he said, like, how do you know? Why, what's your basis? And the guy said, like, and the guy was kind of, didn't know what to say at first, you could see, and then he said something like, well, if somebody takes a certain drug, then it affects their consciousness. So that proves that consciousness is chemical. And the Dalai Lama said, well, who did you test that on? Like, did you test it on people with very strong minds, or, with like, who are good at controlling their mind, and were they better or worse than people who were bad at controlling their minds, at how much it affected their consciousness? Like, how do you know that proof? Like, in other words, what's your proof from that? That doesn't prove something, that proves that chemicals affect the brain, but it doesn't prove that, I don't think. And the Dalai Lama started suggesting different ways to study it, and started pointing out that, like, that in and of itself wasn't proving what the guy was saying it would prove, and was saying you need to do other experiments to prove that. And have you done this kind of experiment or that kind of? And finally, the guy said, well, yeah, we haven't actually proven that, have we? Something like that, which was touching. Like, and the Dalai Lama kind of was like, oh, so that's what you believe. That's your belief. That's like your faith, or something, which I think the guy didn't like. I can't remember exactly how the phrasing was, but there was like it was a friendly exchange, but it was just pointing out that was just a matter of what that person believed, essentially, right? There was he hadn't proven that. There was nothing to prove that. And the Dalai Lama was saying, well, if you're a scientist, can you prove it? And my point is like sometimes we have these, we all have views that we adhere to very strongly as supreme that we haven't quite, and the question here is, can you question them, right? And how strongly do you grasp at them? And that if you're not willing to question a belief that's afflicted, then you're stuck, right? And that's why I've said before, like, in Buddhism, in the Buddhist epistemology, when you have a afflicted view, doubt is helpful, right? And there's the process begins with doubt, and then eventually you can move to a correct, ascertainment. But here, the idea, just to summarize, so here the idea is the conception of a bad view as supreme. What they're getting at is it's an afflicted view that stops you from practicing the path, and that also creates a karmic tendency not to even question that view, and to keep it throughout your life, and then also keep it in future lives. So it will become a kind of karmic obstacle to your practice. And I guess Sujata has, and then Lynn.
Thank you, Lauren. I was hoping we could go back actually to the view, the view holding to an extreme. Mm-hmm. I was caught on from the quote from the Lamrim about the word self. So I've been stuck since then trying to hang on. I'm realizing that I think that I have, I've been conceptualizing something wrong, maybe, I'm not sure. Okay, so when I think about sort of the big self, big S self, like this idea of a permanency, a soul, or even a view of transitory collection that feels permanent, like that feels clear to me. I was curious about the small S self transmigrating to a future life after this life. I think I've always thought of the small S self as the current combination of my transitory collection and my mind stream, and that it's only my mind stream that transmigrates. Does that make sense? And so I think, it just might be a matter of semantics, but I was caught off guard by this notion of the small S self being the thing that transmigrates, rather than, and I very much think of that S, small S self, it's just this current iteration of a bunch of, causes and conditions and molecules and whatever that I call Sujata now, and then that's gone at the end of this life, and that there's a thing that transmigrates, but I don't think of that as a self. So I was wondering if you could help me with that.
One point is, like, if you look in the teachings on I think the question you're raising is prominently sort of explored in interesting ways, I think, in the teachings on Buddhist tenets, because that question, right, is a question that in other words, when because the Buddha said, right, there is no Atman, there's Anatman, right? Like Buddhists throughout history have kind of contended with that question, and sort of what transmigrates, how does that, and the Buddha clearly said, right, there is rebirth and so on. So Buddhists throughout history have kind of addressed that question in different ways, and different tenet systems in a way are expressions in part of how different Buddhist groups, individuals and groups have sort of explored that question. And one point I'll make, though, for a moment, I'll say something from a Prasangika Madhyamaka perspective for a moment, which is different than other perspectives, because it's Prasangika, well, each of them is different in some ways, but the Prasangika is particularly a unique sort of set of tenets that, as you know, are considered highest, most subtle set of tenets. So in the Prasangika Madhyamaka stance on this question, what they actually say is that it's the let me say, right, when they say what transmigrates, they would say it's the merely labeled I, right? So they wouldn't say it's the mind. They wouldn't say it's the mind stream, And in a sense, they would say, interestingly, like, they would just point out that at any given moment, there's a different basis of designation for that merely labeled I, right? Like, so, in the clear, like, and I guess actually it's an interesting point, like, because, other Buddhist tenet systems would tend to say, oh, it's the mind stream, for example, right? But I'll just point out something from a Prasangika perspective, if you combine it with Vajrayana for a moment, right? In the moment of the clear light of death, there's just the clear light experience. So that has to be the basis, so that's the basis. So if somebody were to say, let's say a person died and you say, oh, where is so-and-so, or something, they say, well, the basis, you could merely label the I based on this clear light. But then there's a Bardo consciousness, right? Which is also a subtle body of energy, and so then there's an I based on, it's merely labeled based on both a kind of subtle energy body and a consciousness at that point. So it's not just a consciousness at that point. You see what I'm getting? Like, at that point, the I is merely labeled based on a subtle energy body of the Bardo and a consciousness connected to it. And then so on, so there's all these, and as the person is in the process of dying, right, when they're manifesting, say, the white luminance and the red radiance and the black, well, then those become, those experiences are the basis of designation of that person. So they would say, they would kind of argue that as soon as you sort of assert that there's a mind stream or something, that there may be a subtle grasping in a way at something beyond the merely labeled I. That's a momentary phenomena, where there's a mere label based on a merely appearing basis of designation. So that's a difference. So they would say it's the merely labeled I that transmigrates, whereas some of the lower tenet systems, you could say, I guess, are, some of them do say, oh, it's the mental consciousness that transmigrates or something like that. So it's a difference of different tenet systems. Yeah, so I don't know, does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
It does. That was the refresher from tenants class. I needed to keep going.
No,
Thanks.
it's good. And then Lynn had something too.
That was really interesting. I wonder, what Sujata said is, I wonder if, when you read about death and people passing wherever they're going, you often hear that they see a light. They see a light on the path. So that sort of corresponds to what you were saying very much. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when they come back and talk about it, that's what, like hospice workers and nurses, that's what they say happened. Well, that's what they say they describe to them. So anyway, but my question is a little different. It's like, I was raised Catholic, but I went to public school. So the nuns, we had to take religion classes on Tuesday night. And the nuns said, you can still go to heaven because you're taking this class, but your parents are condemned to hell because they sent you to public school.
Wow.
And, as a kid, you knew that was wrong. You just knew that couldn't be the case.
Oh my goodness.
But it was very strongly held. And I remember it, the more you challenged it, the more extreme the nuns became. And it was just it's sort of what's described here. It's a endurance in a wrong-headed view. And it just became more extreme the more it was challenged. And then that was combined with, at least for Catholics, I don't know other Christian religions, but that believe in heaven and hell. Every survey they took said more people believed in heaven than hell. So the whole belief system was inconsistent because if all our parents were going to hell because they sent us to public school, then how come all these people didn't believe in hell? It just didn't make any sense internally.
Well,
But it's like this construct that, I mean, it shows the value of doubting a wrong-headed extreme view, endurance.
yeah. Yeah, and it does get at that. I like you. I mean, that's why I like that term endurance, is it kind of gets at something there. And it also does get at this point about that's, you know, clearly like in your example of the nun's reaction, it is that's an example of the conception of a bad view as supreme, right? Where it's held so strongly that even a question actually makes you hold it even more strongly. And, you know, it almost it can feel threatening, right? To have somebody question it. I mean, when one holds that, has this concept of a bad view as supreme, don't you see? I mean, the text doesn't say this. I just noticed the same thing you're noticing, which is that it seems almost like anyone who holds that view gets upset when somebody, you know, whenever we have a conception of a bad view as supreme, then we get upset when somebody challenges it, and we find that bothersome or something. Which is, I think maybe that's a sign of having a conception of a bad view as supreme, is when, if somebody challenges your, you know, because I was thinking that, like when somebody says to the Dalai Lama that he's wrong, he laughs and sort of doesn't, you don't see, you know, like it's not like that, right? There's not a sense of consent of, what's the word, of defensiveness or something. So I sometimes, it's just my own personal view, I sometimes think that defensiveness often comes with the conception of a bad view as supreme, where you're, some part of you, you know, it's like you actually don't know this thing, but you're asserting it as the best, and therefore there's an inherent intrinsic insecurity in that or something that I think makes people defensive, as you were describing.
Yeah, I think my view of Catholicism, having been in it until I was, you know, an adult, or, you know, in college, but it also, I think, challenges a worldview. People hold this as part of an overall worldview, and when you challenge that part of it, it challenges their whole way of being in the world in a way that they can't sustain or they can't tolerate.
No, I'm kidding. Yeah, that may, and again, I'll just, well, not again, and I'll just point out, like, one of the things I'll share, I guess, one of the things that when I was, well, actually, when I was in college, right, I remember I met a Geshe teacher of mine who passed away later, but and one of the things I liked about him and that helped me like Buddhism more was, as soon as I met him, he was talking about, well, he was a Geshe, so he talked about his experiences in debate at the monastery. But he was saying, like, oh, you know, he was pointing out debate was questioning all of, like, was questioning every Buddhist belief and saying maybe it's wrong, you know, and debating with other people about them in that way. And I've seen, you know, the friends I have who are, I mean, a number of my friends who are Buddhist monks, like that's one of the things I've always liked about that, is that it's not like that. And whereas it's like, sort of say, well, you know, like the Dalai Lama was doing with that scientist, it's sort of saying, well, okay, let's question it. Let's analyze it. Let's look at it from different angles, you know, and yeah, and anyway, so I mean, as a Buddhist, you know, the idea is that one is supposed to ask those questions, not reject questioning. Yeah, anybody else? Comments or questions? Oh, Wilhelmina, yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking about going through this Catholicism, as I was a Catholic as well. I remember that I was guided in the beginning on my path by an archangel, and I saw Jesus with a pointed head at that place, and I did the Course in Miracles, so that was still all that part that appeared, and I was with hospice, and I wasn't long in it, but I got one chance, and then Rinpoche said, "No, it's finished. Now you stop everything and you start preparing yourself for the next life." And where was I? His Holiness said, when he was with Desmond Tutu, he said, I know where I'm going, but I don't know where you are going, you know? He doesn't know. And now having a sister who is doing a different path in the extension of the old belief system, is that there are guides and they are with you and they send messages and all that. And I saw that also in the Institute of Spiritual Development. So there has to be a place for all those people too, because it's how they grow, how they can evolve. So that has to evolve too. And I see these things happening, and she shares with me some of it, and I think it's very interesting. And it happened as well when Nina was still alive, you know, and I came with stuff and I said to her, have you seen this? And she said, yeah, it's okay, but leave it out of the door, you know. I mean, it's something that's still alive and that is still trying to evolve as well. It's just different. And I think, two sons who have Buddhism in their background as well. And I have one who's a Catholic, and he does it that way. And I have to let that be fine. You know, my grandson too, who has a lot of potential, and I don't know where he will end up eventually, but there is space for that too, you know, and His Holiness gives that space as well by saying, you know, I know what's going on in this universe with the Big Bang and all that, and where we all belong in, but I don't know about what is out there, what the scientists are exploring. So he is such a good mouthpiece for me because he says what he sees, and I believe who he is. I really think he is an emanation of Avalokiteshvara, who is going to be sent here to do whatever needs to be done right now. And so I just wanted to put that into, you know, that we leave that space and that it's not less or more, it's just different. And I have to believe that. I want to believe that. I like to believe that. I embrace it. So that's all I want to say.
Oh, that's great. Well, one just quick comment I want to make related to what people have said. It's not a response exactly, but it's a comment. Is also these 5 afflicted views. One point I make, like all the mental afflictions listed, you know, we're covering all different kinds of mental afflictions, right? The 6 root mental afflictions, the 20 secondary mental afflictions, and so on. I just want to make a general point, which this teaching, you know, that this whole teaching on the mind and mental factors is for introspection, right? In other words, that if one is trying to practice the Dharma, Buddha Dharma, then these are to check on ourselves. So in other words, the job of any of these is not to, like, you know, it's not to what's the word, evaluate or police other people's minds, right? It's to evaluate our own minds. So in other words, so even if like our job here isn't to critique somebody else's, you know, as having an afflicted view, it's actually to check for ourselves, do I have an afflicted view, and is it getting in the way of my own practice? And so I just wanted to emphasize that. So like, you know, so when, I mean, you know, and it's okay to, in examples, it's okay to look at like the culture we're in to see, have I internalized some certain views that from a Buddhist perspective would be an afflicted view, because is that serving as an obstacle to me in my own practice, you know? But beyond that, it's not our job to, you know, that's the purpose of all these. Same thing with anger, right? You don't go around saying, oh, I've studied the psychology of anger and you're very angry. That's not the point. You know, the point is, in what ways am I causing suffering to myself and others through anger, as an example, or afflicted views, for example. So all of these, I just want to point that out, that the goal of studying them is to be able to identify them when they arise in our own mind in order to work through them, so that they don't serve an obstacle to our practicing the path, because that's what they are, right? All the mental afflictions are obstacles that block us from achieving liberation or enlightenment. So that's the purpose of studying them. I just want to remind us that. But then Sujata, that's her hand up.
Thank you for that reminder, Lauren. I think I'm struggling with this one. This last one, the conception of the bad view as supreme, and whether or not there's ever an affliction where there's a conception of the correct view as supreme, and the arrogance that comes from whatever small understanding I have of the right view. And just what is there to guard against that? I think it's one of the things I'm noticing is that when I'm in the presence of folks who seem super deluded and are really sort of reifying their view, and I'm noticing in myself, even if I stay silent about it, I don't try to proselytize anybody to my view or whatever. And yet I notice in myself like sometimes it's just like whew, I'm glad I don't think that, and that feels like an okay, rejoicey kind of thing. But then sometimes I'm feeling some arrogance in there. So maybe it's just emptiness, reminding myself that this I that is feeling arrogant doesn't exist. But I'm just wondering if it's interesting that the zealotness, and I've even come in contact with some teachers sometimes that it feels like it's out of, deep desire for the students to not suffer in this and future lifetimes, where they're just like hammering home the right view, right? And then sometimes there's a little bit of, I don't know, I shouldn't judge, but yeah, so catching myself to not do the thing that you just said not to do and turning it back to myself. So what is there around just protecting ourselves from the sort of zealotness around what small grasp we might have on right view?
I guess a couple of things. I mean, one is, I think, and when you were describing that, at one point I would make is, I agree, and there is a difference, isn't there, between like, seriously, right? Like, if one feels joy or gratitude or something for finding a correct view, then that would be virtuous, right? Like, for example, rejoicing in something good is a good thing. So you have to differentiate. Like, so if one is rejoicing in oneself finding a correct view about something, that would be virtue. If one feels grateful for finding a correct understanding of something, that would be virtue. But on the other hand, like what you were getting at, I think there are two things that I wondered about, I guess, and if I think of like moments when, what's there to say, right? Where there's that more like dynamic of where it's in connection to what Buddhism would assert as a correct view, but one is feeling kind of so one is, for sure, there would be the view of the transitory collection there, right? Like, that's one point, right? In other words, so if I feel, wow, I know, and this person doesn't, right? Going back to the view of the transitory collection, right? It's a endurance, a desire, an intelligence, a conception, or a view, which views the five appropriate aggregates as a real I and mine, right? And so it's like an I and then my view, that in that sense that the mind would be the view, right? But there's a kind of, so that would be an example of the view of the transitory collection where it's an I know, and my view is better. So that would be like a grasping at, and that's useful to recognize. So in other words, if we're practicing this, one would go, oh, wow, am I coming across this, this person who said that, and then I think they're wrong, and I think I'm right. And so even if I'm right in the sense of like, let's say I believe in karma or ethics or something or other, that's fine. Like, that's not the problem. The problem is viewing the five appropriate aggregates as a real I and mine, right? That's one point. And then the other is, I was just going to go back. The other one is the first version of pride, actually. And I just want to read it again. It's on page 56, but the first of the 7 types of pride, the first is a pride. Pride is a puffing up of the mind, thinking one is superior to lower persons. So in other words, in that first version of pride, what it's saying, which is interesting in this in your example, it would be that actually precisely, is and I love, in a way, the definition is great, right? Because the definition is saying they are lower, and in the context of a view, let's say, somebody, so if one person has a view that's a wrong view, let's say, and then if I have a correct view about that same topic, I'm just making up a fictional example here, that's not problematic. But the first of the 7 types of pride is where I feel a puffing up of my mind, and that, and what it says, and we said this last time, I just want to remind us that when we say superior to a lower person, it just means lower in whatever context one is. It doesn't mean like they may be more whatever, they may be more intelligent than me, they may be more attractive than me, they may be more wealthy than me, but in the context of views, right? So it's grasping, it's saying, well, in views I'm better than them, and then puffing up based on that. So that would actually be the first of the 7 types of pride. And it's where so that would be exactly that, though, right? That in some context you correctly perceive, oh, I am actually superior to this person in this particular way, right? Like, but it'd be like, I don't know, I remember when I was a little kid, right? You think, oh, I'm taller than so-and-so. Like, your kids, right? You're whatever, or something. I was playing basketball probably. So it was like, oh, wow. Like, well, that's factual. Like, in other words, I was taller than that other kid. But as soon as I start to think, oh, therefore, I'm like puffing myself up, it's like that, right? And it becomes a kind of ridiculous. So that would be pride in particular, wouldn't it? So, and it would be under anything. My point is, it could be about anything. But in the case, your example you were giving, it's about worldviews or something. So I think that would actually be, the first of the 7 types of pride in particular.
That's helpful. Thank you, Lauren.
Other comments or questions? Let's see. Then the next of these 5 is the conception of bad ethics and modes of conduct as supreme. So and then again, regarding that, he quotes the Compendium of Knowledge. So what is the conception of bad ethics and modes of conduct as supreme? Again, it is any endurance, desire, intelligence, conception, or view which views bad ethics and modes of conduct and the locus of bad ethics and modes of conduct, that is the 5 appropriate aggregates of the person engaging in them, to be purifying, liberating, and delivering. It has the function of acting as support for fruitless fatigue. So a couple of points, like modes of conduct, sometimes that's translated as asceticism, but I looked up the definition in Art's translation of Vasubandhu, and it said, so modes of conduct or asceticism here refers to spiritual observances associated with outer appearances, conduct, and activities of body, speech, and mind. So in this case, it would be negative asceticism or negative ethics. And then going back to what we read, just what I just read. So it says, so it would be viewing bad ethics or bad modes of conduct in that sense, or the locus of them, meaning the aggregates of the person engaging in them, which would mostly be oneself. So to view them as, where it says purifying, means to think that they purify bad karma or bad actions, sins, whatever you want to call them. To view them as liberating means to view that they grant liberation, moksha, right? Liberation from the mental afflictions, liberation from samsara. Or I'm sorry, liberating means liberating from the mental afflictions. And then delivering means that believing they'll grant the state of arhatship or Buddhahood, that they'll give you some kind of deliverance to a kind of supreme state. So the point is that, what happens in this kind of afflicted view is that you learn somehow, you, I guess, learn or you come up with on your own, either a bad version of ethics, and I mean, there, a bad version of ethics or a bad version of kind of spiritual behavior, and then you believe it will lead you to some kind of great result, right? And what it says here, its function is the support for fruitless fatigue. In other words, that if you're engaging in the wrong method, it doesn't bear any fruit and it's exhausting, is what they're pointing out. So it's a frustrating process if you, if anybody does that. And then it says, just as has been said above, it is an afflicted wisdom that observes bad ethics motivated by bad views or bad modes of conduct that prescribe physical and mental activities such as wearing animal skins, and the abode of bad ethics and bad conduct they follow for desires to be purifying and liberating. So I just want to explain a little more what it's getting at here. The bad modes of I want to first start with the bad modes of conduct. And these are like things that a person views as spiritual practice that actually don't bear a result that's desirable. So traditionally, examples of that, here it gives example wearing animal skins, but there are examples of that, like some kinds of in the Buddha's life story, there are examples of like certain asceticisms, right? Like people who would do like harm their body. And in various spiritual traditions, there are things like that, right? Doing things that harm your body. There are people who like hurt themselves and so on, thinking that's spiritual practice. And what this is saying is that's an extreme, right? That would be grasping an extreme. So if you're harming yourself, thinking that's going to help your, harming your own body, for example, or harming your own mind, thinking that's going to help your spiritual practice, that would be an example of this. Anything of that sort. In one text, they give an example of like people who burn themselves, burn parts of their body or something as part of their spiritual practice. They would say that's grasping it. And in the Buddha's life story, right? There was a point when he was like starving himself, right? To the point where he was not strong enough to actually engage in spiritual practice, right? And that was like a prescribed method in his group of people he had met in his time. And then he went and ate, and they got mad at him and left. The 5 other ascetics left, right? And after he ate some rice milk with honey, I think it was, and later they became his first 5 disciples. But he realized that like that was an extreme form of asceticism, right? And he abandoned that. He said, this doesn't make sense. It's not leading where it should lead. So those would be examples of that. I think actually under that would also be bad ethics. An example of bad ethics also would be, there are traditions where people, do animal sacrifice, for example, right? Like, so somebody thinks, it's kind of, from a Buddhist perspective, it's a horrible idea, isn't it? So somebody thinks, I'll purify myself by killing, an animal or something, or a person, actually. Actually, that happened with people, right? That was what the, holy wars, right, would be an example of that. I'll purify myself and go to heaven by killing somebody. That would be an example of a bad ethics motivated by a bad view, right? And actually, I'm going to go off on a short aside here, just because I was actually quite personally touched by this. It was weird. I was actually, this is connected to Lynn was saying, but it was like last month, I think it was, sometime in the last few months, I was reading, at the same time I was reading an autobiography of the great 5th Dalai Lama. And I was also reading a book, actually it was about from the time of Constantine on, it was actually a Catholic history, written by a former Catholic monk, but it was a history of prejudice and anti-Semitism in Catholicism. And what struck me was, I was reading these 2 books at the same time, and in the same week, I read each described somebody having a vision. And I was like, oh, wow, this is fascinating. So in one, it was this Catholic former monk was describing how somebody had claimed to have a vision. It was like a Catholic practitioner, but their vision suggested like creating a holy war and going and killing people. And so they did that, and they started a crusade, and they killed a lot of people. And at first they killed some Jewish people, and they killed Muslim people, and they said, it's good. And killing non-Christians, if they won't convert, was a good thing. And I was like, that would be an example of bad ethics motivated bad view. And then in the same week, I was reading this autobiography of the great 5th Dalai Lama, and the great 5th Dalai Lama described some Buddhist monk had come to him and said, I don't know if he was a monk or not, some Buddhist practitioner, Tibetan, had come to him and said he'd had a vision, that he was a Turton, that he had seen a terma, and that he was like, and the 5th Dalai Lama was a terma. He had visions like that. And this guy came to him and he looked, he said, what's the content of your vision? And the guy told him, and he said, that's not right. That's wrong. Like, that's not going to help beings. It's harmful to beings. And he rejected it and said, we're not going to practice, people shouldn't practice that because it'll harm people. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, there needs to be, it's like the value of critical intelligence, even in relation to vision, was my point. I was reading these 2 different things, and I was like, not every vision is a good thing, like, in other words, a vision that leads to hatred, for example, it would be an example of a bad ethics that comes from a bad view, right? Where one is mistaking one's spirituality. And Buddhism isn't immune to that. That's my point. So I was very, very moved that the great fifth Dalai Lama, when somebody kind of had a vision that was like that, he said, no, that's not correct. And, because it included like prejudice against other Buddhist groups, actually, where this person was saying, I had this vision, and he was like wanting the Dalai Lama to support him because he was saying, and I think your group is right and that other group is wrong. And the great fifth Dalai Lama said, well, I think you're wrong. And basically get out of here and don't like, I'm not interested in that vision. And the guy thought the fifth Dalai Lama would buy into it because he was like, sort of, my vision was that you're right and everybody else is bad and we should, they're the enemy and you're good. And he said, no, that's a wrong vision. Actually, that's not what the intent of the Buddhism is, and I reject that. And I was like, wow, even with, that he was being careful not, one is he wasn't taking sides, like sort of this adversarial thing in that moment with that person. But, it's this idea that, one shouldn't mistake. That's anyway, it's an example of bad ethics and bad behavior and not taking them to be supreme. So then he quotes Lama Tsongkhapa. He says, the conception of bad ethics and mode of conduct as supreme is an afflicted wisdom which observes bad ethics, which supposedly abandon immorality, or bad modes of conduct which prescribe attire, behavior, and physical and verbal activities, or the aggregates of the viewer in dependence upon which they, the above two, bad ethics and bad modes of conduct, arise, and views them as purifying misdeeds, right? So as if they would purify karma, as liberating one from the afflictions, and as definitely delivering one from psychic existence. And again, they serve as a support for fruitless fatigue. So you see the point here, though. Like, so if somebody were to say, like, again, in my example, right? If somebody were to say, "Oh, you'll purify your negative karma by fighting against this other group," that's, that would be an example of this, right? Anyway, so. And one point I want to make is we have to be careful, to check, like, because like a tire, right? Like, in other words, there's a, the current Dalai Lama will often point out, right? Like, Tibetans wear different colored hats, right, in their traditions. And he says the Buddha didn't wear a hat. It doesn't matter in the end. Like, hats aren't what grant liberation. It's one's inner practice. So it's, in the end, it's not one's attire, and it's not, and even like we can even recognize, like, in Buddhism we do, Tibetan Buddhism we do certain mudras and certain rituals and things like that. But according, actually, it's a funny point. We do all these things, right? You can hold a vajra or hold a bell and ring a bell, and what this point is pointing out is ring a bell doesn't grant liberation. Actually, the meaning of ring a bell is actually, if when we ring a bell in Tibetan Buddhism, the idea is actually that it symbolizes emptiness, actually, right? And the idea is that when the clangor hits the sides of the bell, the sound is dependent upon the movement of the clangor hitting the side of hitting the metal, the one piece of metal hitting the other in the shape of the bell, that gives rise to the experience of sound and dependence upon one's ears and sound waves and so on. And so, like, sound is dependently arisen. It doesn't exist intrinsically from its own side, right? It's unfindable. You can't find the sound in the ear. You can't find it in the clangor. You can't find it in the body of the bell. So sound is dependently arisen. So it's a reminder of emptiness. And so, if you ring a bell and you think about emptiness, well, then that has meaning, because emptiness is the nature of reality, according to this teaching, right? But just ringing a bell doesn't lead to liberation. That's the point. So, that would be an example, even in our own Buddhist tradition. Like, if one sort of thinks, oh, as long as I ring the bell a lot, I'll achieve liberation, that would be a mistake. And actually, that would be a mistake then, right? It's if you give rise to an understanding of emptiness while ringing the bell, then that has meaning. Otherwise, it's just making noise or something. So here, it's recognizing, that prescribed attire, behavior. My point is that it's easy to think that about some other group, but we have to check for ourselves. Am I doing that? Am I thinking that something will lead to liberation that doesn't lead to liberation. And if I am, you know, like just the other day I was doing that, where I was like, I was tired, I've been having some fatigue lately, and I was tired, so I was like doing certain prayer quickly. And then I stopped and I was like, does that have any meaning at all? Like, I know the words, but I was just like, I was tired, so I was saying the words quickly. And I was like, that doesn't actually have any meaning at all. It's not, it doesn't lead to purification or liberation or to deliverance. So like, why am I doing that then? That doesn't make any sense. So we have to apply it to ourselves, is my point. It's not, but so anyway, so there are subtle versions of this, but you know, extreme versions of it will be harming others and so on. That's never, you know, for doing something that harms others, thinking that's ethical, that's never the right understanding. And Geshe Rabdin, we're on this thing of acting as a support for fruitless fatigue. I just like the Geshe Rabdin said, we exhaust ourselves while achieving no real goals. So what the result of this is that, you know, you get which I guess, yeah, it's funny. That's kind of what I was doing that night. You know, when I was tired and I was just saying the words of a certain prayer, like I was like, wow, I'm already tired now. I'm exhausting myself and I'm not going to achieve any goal from this because I'm not actually thinking of the meaning. So it's just empty, you know, it's an empty ritual or something. So I was doing that the other night, you know, luckily I caught it. And then the fifth of these 5 afflicted views is wrong views. So not all, and this one, wrong view, is, you know, it's different. So there's a difference between I caught myself earlier saying the wrong thing. So all 5 of these are afflicted views, but only the last is wrong view, if that makes sense. And wrong views, one of the commentaries said this, I was double checking because I thought it did, but I wasn't sure, but one of the commentaries agreed that it's what's the word? It's the same as the you know, the 10 non-virtues, right? There are 3 of mind, right? You know, so covetousness, ill will, and wrong view. This is that. So this would be the 10th of the 10 non-virtues, wrong view, you know, holding to wrong views. So we'll go on. Regarding wrong view, the Compendium of Knowledge, the Abhidharma says, what is wrong view? Okay, it is any endurance, desire, intelligence, conception, or view, in this case, which deprecates cause, result, or functionality, and wrongly conceives existent, disintegrating things. That is the function of severing roots of virtue, holding tightly to roots of non-virtue, and acting as a support for engaging in non-virtue and not engaging in virtue. So one point is these kinds of wrong views where it says severing roots of virtue, there are certain things that where even if you do a virtuous action, you know, like it can destroy your good karma. So where it says severing roots of virtue, that's this. That means, like, so for example, they give examples like hatred. You know, even if you do good actions, if you then develop hatred, it can destroy your own good karma. Also, holding to wrong views can destroy your own good karma. It severs the roots of your virtue. It like burns. They say it's like a seed that won't grow or something. If you cultivate this particular kind of afflictive view, it can cause your good karma not to be able to ripen. It also causes you to do more non-virtue, right, and to enhance your non-virtuous tendencies if you do this one. And so it says here, it deprecates cause, result, or functionality and wrongly conceives existent, disintegrating things. One point is, you know, well, I'll say this. I'll read something Geshe Rabdin said. He said it mostly, first of all, there are 2 types of wrong views. And one is the main referent here. So that something exists and it denies that it exists. Sometimes it can also, so mostly there are different debates, I guess, among Buddhist teachers. All of them agree that I would call it denigrating. So like where something exists and you say it doesn't exist is the main referent here. Some Buddhist teachers say also implying that something does exist where it doesn't can be a wrong view also in this sense. But we'll start, most of the examples are denying that something exists and you deny that it exists. That would be the wrong view. But it's not just anything. So it's not saying like, you know, let's say it right. It wouldn't be like if I say, oh, there's such a thing as yellow roses, and then you said, no, there's not, and that would be wrong view. That's not the referent here, right? So because yellow roses do exist, and if you deny them, that's not a wrong view in this sense. It's spiritually significant things. They're things that are important to your spiritual practice. So in particular, the examples that are usually given are karmic cause and effect, which is what's referred to here, where it says deprecates means denies, right? So it's denying that cause and effects function. It could also be denying that there's such a thing as liberation or enlightenment, right? So it would be with confidence and with a person strongly asserting or grasping at a view that there is no such thing as karmic causes, that there is no result of your actions, that liberation is impossible, that Buddhahood is impossible. So if somebody those are examples of wrong views, right? So those things, according to Buddhism, exist, and Buddhism saying they exist, and if you say they don't exist, then you're denying something that exists, is the idea. So here it says, just as has been said above, it is an afflicted wisdom which views cause and result of actions and past and future lives and so forth as non-existent. Right. So if you say there's no such thing as rebirth, that would be an example of a wrong view. And then, so it's holding or grasping such strong views. And again, it could destroy your roots of virtue. So it says, just as been said above, so the great exposition of the stage of the path says, wrong view is an afflicted wisdom which deprecates stating past and future lives, actions and the results, and so forth do not exist. And so forth could include like liberation, enlightenment, and so on. And then here, he also, Lama Tsongkhapa adds in, what's the word, reifying, or adding, saying that something that doesn't exist does. So it says, it holds that Ishvara, the fundamental nature, and the like are the cause of migrating beings. So in other words, if you say, these are different philosophical positions of other traditional non-Buddhist Indian schools of thought, right? So holding that Ishvara is the cause of sentient beings or migrating beings, or that the fundamental nature is the cause of migrating beings. Those would be examples of wrong views in this sense. So that was an example. So you see the point there. It could be denigrating something that does exist, or it could be reifying something that doesn't exist. Mostly it's the denigrating. Then it says, when wrong view is divided, there are four. And we'll go through, actually, we'll read the list of definitions because they're the same. So the wrong view that deprecates causes is the view that good behavior and bad behavior and so forth do not exist. Right. So that would be saying the karmic causes don't exist. So there's no such thing as good and bad, right? Some philosophers have actually, some ancient Indian philosophers have said that, and some European philosophers have said that, right? There is no such thing as good and bad behavior. That would be a wrong view, and it's actually, and I'll say at one point, and it isn't. I mean, and that's kind of it's a wrong view, and it's also kind of a horrifying view, isn't it? In other words, because I would say that, for example, torturing somebody isn't bad, right? Killing isn't bad, so that's a wrong view. Then the wrong view that deprecates results is the view that the fruition of virtuous actions and misdeeds do not exist. And again, that's a wrong view. It's saying that there's no bad result if you harm others, and that's Buddhism saying that's wrong. That's simply a wrong view. And I want to point this out, just reminding us, right? Because sometimes people think, I just want to point out, sometimes people think that emptiness, wrongly think. Sometimes people wrongly think that emptiness implies there's no good and bad actions, right? That people sometimes wrongly say that, and all Buddhists agree on these points, right? In other words, so there's no Buddhist tenet system. These are all Buddhist tenet systems agree that there are such things as good actions and bad actions, and that good actions lead to good results and bad actions lead to bad results. And so my point is that if your view of selflessness or of emptiness makes you think that there's no such thing as good and bad actions, then that's a wrong view, right? From any Buddhist perspective. So there's no Buddhist perspective that there's no Buddhist teaching that says that if you harm others, that's a good thing, or it doesn't matter, right? That's not, you know, and there's no Buddhist school that says that if you act based on compassion skillfully to help others, that there won't be a good result to that. All Buddhist schools agree that you know, that the causality, karmic causality functions. Then the wrong view that deprecates functionality is the view that one's parents, past and future worlds and rebirths and so forth do not exist. So it's a kind of nihilism, right? And then the wrong view that deprecates existent things is the view that the attainment of the foe destroyer and so forth do not exist, right? So there's no liberation and no enlightenment. It says, although in general there are many wrong views, since the wrong view which deprecates actions and their results, past and future worlds, i.e. rebirths and so forth, severs all roots of virtue, it is taught to be the most serious among all the wrong views. So you get the point here. This is like a very most fundamental of all Buddhist teachings. And, you know, whether somebody who is not Buddhist and is asserting that, or somebody's Buddhist and is saying they think Buddhism asserts that, Buddhism is saying that's wrong. You know, is from any perspective, the view that there's no process of causality among karmic action. Karma just means action, so action and results, or past and future lives, and so on. They're saying that's just wrong. And I'll just he goes on to explain a little more. So he says, furthermore, when the 5 types of views are condensed, they can be subsumed into 2 views that superimpose, right, that add something that doesn't exist, or views that deprecate, that deny something that does exist. When the 5 are divided, there are infinite divisions. So he's saying, you know, these are 5 to help us introspect. And he's saying, actually, if you want to think deeply about it, there are infinite divisions of possible wrong views. See, and actually, as long as you have the view of the transitory collection, there's an infinite number of ways to make up wrong views, aren't there? That's true, actually. And then he says the 20 views of the transitory collection, the 62 bad views, the 14 unspecified views, and so forth. So he's giving examples of long lists of wrong views. He says the 62 bad views are taught in the net of Brahma, the Brahma Jala Sutra. Fearing wordiness, if I were to set forth the individual entities in detail, I should not mention them here. So he decides not to go into the detail on the list of those 62 bad views in the net of Brahma Sutra. I'll just point out, and I'm not going to try to explain all 62 by any means, but that's translated. So the net of Brahma Sutra is translated in the long discourses of the Buddha, book published by Wisdom Publications, which is a translation of the Digha Nikaya from Pali. And actually, it's interesting. One thing I'll say is it lists many different wrong views, and they are just elaborations of what's been explained here. But it's a discourse with the Buddha, where the Buddha is explaining views that were current, people he had come across who had different wrong views, and he's saying these are wrong views. And one thing I just thought was interesting was that he, I'm just going to jump to one point. So he says here, where it says it's called the net of Brahma Sutra, and then he says, the Buddha says here, it's like a net with 62 divisions. Whenever they try to emerge and try to get out, they are caught and held in this net. So he's saying these wrong views are like, the reason why it's called the net of Brahma Sutra is that the net part is what the Buddha actually said, was that these wrong views are like a net, and you're like a fish caught in a net. So if you let yourself get caught in one of these various wrong views that, in some of them we've been talking about here, then then you'll be like a fish caught in a net. You won't be free, and he's saying that those kinds of all these different kinds of wrong views are like that. So there are many different elaborations. And then he mentions the 14 unspecified views. And that's I just wanted to pause on that one because those are often talked about. And So the 14 unspecified views he goes into, he says 4 views which are based on the 4 views which are based on the past limit are views that the self and the world are permanent or impermanent or both or neither, a future limit and so on. A view of the self and the world have a limit, do not have a limit. Those come from a famous, actually, from the Majjhima Nikaya, a different collection of sutras. And I have a translation of that here, of this, and this translator called it "Questions Which Tend Not to Edification." I'll just share very briefly. I don't want to take up too much time, but there's a famous story where it's a famous story historically of the Buddha, where the Buddha was in Jetavana Monastery in Anathapindika's Park, a place where he often spent time. And there was a person who was thinking to himself, the Buddha didn't explain certain things. He didn't say if the world is, and this person had these questions: is the world eternal or is it not eternal? Is the world finite or is it infinite? And so on. Does an arhat exist after death, or does an arhat not exist after death? And so this person was upset that the Buddha hadn't explained those things. And so he came to the Buddha and he said, I'm not going to follow your teaching unless you explain these 14 things to me. And the Buddha is wonderful. So the Buddha says to this guy, well, did I ever say to you, I will explain those things and you should follow my path because I explained them? And the guy says, no, you never did say that. And then basically what the Buddha says is, the Buddha gives this famous analogy where he says to the guy, he says, you're like somebody who was shot by a poison arrow, and a physician came to you with a cure to the poison. And you said to the physician, I won't accept that cure unless you tell me, and then he lists all these examples. Who's the person who made the arrow? What was their father and mother's name? Who made the poison? What kind of plant did the poison come from? Where was the bow wound? Who made the string for the bow? And he says, and the Buddha says, if the person asked all those questions of the doctor, surely they would die before they got if they refused to take the cure for the poison until they knew who wound the string on the bow, and who made the poison, and who made the arrow, and what the mother and father of the arrow maker's name were, that person would die. And then he says, just so if you wait until you know the answer to these questions before you practice the path, you won't achieve liberation, and you won't get the benefit of my path. So those questions tend not to edification for you. It's a famous story. The Buddha, you can read it. It's translated in a number of places from the Majjhima Nikaya. But in essence, what that's getting at is that they actually say this, that let's say right, that the Buddha's teaching is about suffering, the cause of suffering, and liberation from suffering, and that's the focus. So anyway, then he goes on. Our author goes on to say, these views were asserted by the Samkhya's and the Charvakas and the Nigrantas, the Vatsiputras, and so on, right? So he's giving examples of non-Buddhist Indian schools of philosophy that existed in the early period of when Buddhism existed in India. And he's saying, and one point, or the translator here, the Charvakas are hedonists, anyway, so on. One point I'll make is that just, many of those same philosophies you can easily, they're not identical, but similar doctrine, similar views were expounded by Greek philosophers, Roman philosophers, other, philosophers of all different cultures. So here's being pointed out they're wrong. Some of them are, many those views are different wrong views. He says here I've merely mentioned the names of a few views. If you wish to understand in detail their individual entities, as well as the manner in which they arose, you should consult with the Precious Sutras and the middle way texts that comment upon their intention. So what he's getting at there, right, is that's why because he said consult with those texts, that's why I'm mentioning. So, you can read the translations in English if you're interested in this, of the Digha Nikaya and the Majjhima Nikaya. Those are the sutras, and the middle way texts. If you want to read about that, Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti bring up these different philosophical positions in order to refute them. So you can find them in Nagarjuna's text and in Chandrakirti's text and in Aryadeva's text. So those are the middle examples of the middle way text. Excuse me. So if you're interested in that, you can actually find where different Buddhist teachers, including the Buddha himself, and then Nagarjuna and so on, bring up those different wrong views and refute them, and explain why they're not true. And then he goes on to an interesting point here. Those 14 unspecified views, which I just mentioned from the Majjhima Nikaya, right, with that guy where he says like the arrow, it's like the arrow, poison arrow. He says, why are these views called unspecified? This is kind of, I think, worth noting. He says they are called unspecified not because they are neither posited as virtue or not, or as non-virtue. Rather, when the Samkhyas and so forth, proceeding from the assumption of a self of persons, question whether the self and the world are permanent or impermanent and so forth, the Buddha deemed them to be unsuitable vessels for the time being. He did not teach the selflessness of the person. And with the thought, then the absence of a qualified basis, a qualifying attribute, is inappropriate, the Buddha did not respond to these questions. Hence, they are called unspecified. In this way, the Precious Garland says, when asked whether the world has an end, the conqueror remains silent, because he did not teach to non-vessels the profound Dharma. The wise understand that the omniscient one is indeed omniscient. So what is that actually saying? So what it's saying is, these were unspecified because, there are two different ways to say this. One is the way it's being said here, which is that the person asking it wasn't a suitable vessel or suitable recipient. So one point there is that Buddhism, I don't want to say this right, one thing about Buddhism is Buddhism doesn't say teach Buddhism to everybody, right? And although the Buddhism asserts that emptiness is the ultimate view, it doesn't say teach emptiness to everybody. Actually, there's a Bodhisattva vow that says don't teach emptiness to some. Even though emptiness is the solution to is the ultimate solution to the cause of suffering, it actually says you shouldn't teach emptiness indiscriminately because it may harm people who aren't inclined towards that or can't benefit from it. So that's one point, is that the Buddha, and in this case, where these people, the person was asking those questions, right, they were asking them based on an assumption. What this is pointing out here, where it says, proceeding from the assumption of a self of persons, right? In other words, so in this case, I would say this, because I actually think it's getting at something psychologically useful. So that's why I'm sort of pausing to reflect for a minute on this. Is what this is saying is that somebody came to the Buddha in that story I just read about with the example of the arrow, and asked a bunch of intellectual questions, right? Does the world have an end or does it not have an end? Does a saint or arhat take rebirth after death, or do they not take rebirth after death? What he's pointing out is that person actually was grounded in the view of the transitory collection, and had a kind of what was it called? Held that view as supreme, actually, right? So they were challenging the Buddha based on holding their view of the transitory collection as supreme, right? And I think what this is implying, this is the way I take this, is I'm going back to what Lynn said about her Catholic nun experience, right? What the Buddha understood was that if somebody holds a wrong view as supreme, and then you say to them you're wrong, they're just going to get upset with you, and they're going to actually get defensive and hold that wrong view even more strongly, right? So what this is saying is, this particular person who came to him in that discourse was a follower of the Samkhya philosophy, who held that the view of self-grasping is the supreme view, right? So the Buddha wasn't going to say to that person, there's no self, because that person would then become even more entrenched in there because they held their view as supreme, right? So it's not helpful. So the Buddha wouldn't do something that wasn't helpful, so he didn't do that. But he also wasn't going to answer those questions because they were based on a wrong assumption, right? In other words, those questions were based on an assumption that there's a real self. And then he's saying, is that real self reborn after death or not? Is that real self if I become, if I turn my real self into an arhat, will I still exist after my death? And what the Buddha recognizes, the basis upon which that person was asking those questions was a wrong basis. So it wasn't possible to answer those questions in a way that person could understand. And so, so the Buddha then didn't answer those questions. And I think it's getting at an important point here, which is, the Buddha himself and Buddhism doesn't assert that you should go argue against everyone else's wrong views, right? And what the Buddha did instead for this person was he said to them, I'm like a physician, and what I teach is an antidote to the poison. If you want that antidote, you're welcome to it for free. If you don't want it, that's okay, right? It was a very skillful answer, I think. But anyway, you get the point there. I think it's pretty clear. So it wasn't saying the Buddha, at one point Nagarjuna is saying here is, it's not saying the Buddha, from the Buddha's own perspective, didn't know the answer to those questions or couldn't answer them. Some of them are answered in other texts, actually. Some of them are, some aren't. But what it's saying is it useful to answer those questions, right? And are they being asked? And also, actually, one other comment is worth thinking about is, I don't know if sometimes I've had the experience of asking a Buddhist teacher a question and they don't answer it. And then I have to think, and I just want to point out this story gets at something, which is that I'm being like that Samkhya. It's like, what's what I say, right? Sometimes, actually, have you ever seen that? I've seen that also, like, that happens often where, like, somebody will say to me, like, somebody will say, well, how can I ask Khenpo Rinpoche this question? And sometimes I think it's a great question. Often, usually it's a great question. But sometimes sometimes you can, like, if you can tell that, what's there to say, right? There's an underlying assumption that makes it an unanswerable question, right? And so we all do that, So, from a Buddhist perspective, if there's an assumption underlying a question that's wrong, then the question, so it's like it's like that example of what was the one that when did you stop beating somebody? Like, if you weren't beating the person, you can't answer that question, right? There are certain questions that the person frames it in a way that, I think this person did that, where you frame the question in a way where it can't be answered in a useful way or a helpful way or an accurate way. So then it shouldn't be answered. This is part of the Buddhist stance. And also the implicit here is, again, that Buddhism doesn't say anybody should go around telling everybody that Buddhism is correct, right? And that's not the point of these teachings. They're to look at our own mind and see where we're not correct and correct ourselves. So anyway, I know we got to stop in a minute. Any other questions or comments before we stop? So maybe I'll just take two more quick things. So next time we'll start in on the 20 secondary mental afflictions. It's too big a topic to start even with 8 minutes to go, so we won't start them. But that's the last big section of the text, and then there's a concluding. And then there's the changeable mental factors, and then there's the concluding part. So anyway, we'll continue on with that. And one other question before I do, actually, I thought to ask you guys something before I do the dedication. If anybody has input, I guess I'll just say this. If anybody has any input from you, I have a question, and if you have input, send me an email, I guess, with it. But I sent a note, actually, it wasn't a letter, I have to do a letter now. I sent a note inviting Kadrola, who's a female Tibetan yogini teacher, Dakini. Kadrola means Dakini, actually. So her name, her title, that's not her name, actually, it's her title, I guess, or her ascription. Kadrola means sky goer, actually. Right? So it's a Tibetan term for the Sanskrit word Dakini. Anyway, I invited her to come to Guya Samaja Center And I got a note back saying it'd be better if we ask for a particular topic, because she won't probably respond until we specify what we're asking her to teach on. And so if anybody has input on that, I'm gonna try to come up with that and then get a letter together. It has to be in Tibetan, so we'll get the letter in Tibetan drafted somehow. But if anybody has, so if any of you are local and are interested in that, and you have topics you'd be curious to hear her talk about, I'm going to take input from as many people as are interested, and then I'll sort of choose something that I think she can relate to, I guess. Lynn, you have a comment or a question?
What are the nature of the subjects we might think about to propose?
That's something I don't know. I don't know her, actually. I've never met her in person, and I've only kind of seen her online and a little bit, some things. So like my impression is that the few things, so I want to do a little research into that personally. So I don't know, but from what I've seen, like the talks I've seen were kind of they weren't like initiations or things like that, and they also weren't like on great Buddhist texts. I don't know if she does teach. I just don't know. I haven't. She may teach great Buddhist like treatises, but I haven't seen a lot of that. Most of what I've personally seen are like, I don't know what the word is, like talks on real lived sort of everyday question, like, how do you integrate wisdom into real life, or how do you integrate compassion into daily life, or how do you cultivate bodhicitta in the context of family life or work life or things like that. Those are the things I've seen, but that's only what I've seen. So I'm going to kind of Google around to see if there are other talks she's given, because like, but most of what I've seen that she's talked on, when I sort of see something posted, I guess, it's been these kind of general topics. I would say I haven't seen that. Maybe she does, but I haven't seen that she's giving like initiations. I also haven't seen her. Maybe she does, but I just haven't seen it where like she's giving a formal commentary on, the Majjhima Avatar or something. That's not what I've seen. I've seen more like, how do you integrate emptiness into relationships or something or other like that. So, but that's what I've seen. But people can Google around too. I don't know her personally, so I've never met her, so I don't really know her beyond just what I've seen like that. And part of the reason part of the reason we invited one is I think it would be great to have a female Tibetan teacher teach, and also she's Lama Zopa Rinpoche praises her very highly as kind of somebody who's, I think, realized emptiness and is kind of a yogini, true practitioner, and she's also like, I guess she's quite close to the Dalai Lama, and it's also is kind of an oracle for the Tibetan. She kind of is considered an oracle for the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan government. She came and offered that service, but I don't know her, so I'm just saying what I read or heard. But and other lamas also, I often have seen like she's not just connected to FEMT. I've seen like Nyingma and Kagyu lamas who are quite connected to her and seem to praise her very highly as a great realized kind of practitioner, somebody who has an inner realization of the teachings. And I guess that's just the other thing is, I guess my impression is that, she's not somebody who kind of went through the monastic system. She's not a nun. So she didn't, so maybe that's why, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's why I haven't seen that she teaches a lot of like these big treatise texts, but she's obviously studied quite a lot. And I think she's somebody that has a kind of inner realization of the practices. The impression is that she's somebody who's kind of, Tibetan lamas seem to say that she's somebody, I mean, I don't met her, so I don't know, but Tibetan lamas seem to say she's somebody who's kind of realized the practice. So I think she likes to teach practical things, is my impression, but I don't know.
What does it mean to be His Holiness's oracle? What does that mean?
I guess Tibetan culture has a lot of that, I guess, oracle. I mean, it's part of Tibetan culture. And the idea there, I guess, is that I guess there are like, the ideas in Tibetan culture is that there are certain, let's say right. Tibetan culture certainly says that there are certain like, or many of them like from the time of Padmasambhava or Milarepa or like from past historical periods, that they're like, I guess you would call them spirits or something, like non-human beings who took vows, like who are practitioners of Buddhism, who took vows. Like, so there are very famous stories where Padmasambhava came to Tibet and taught actually non-humans, like taught there were spirits who he became his disciples, and they promised to help, like they promised, Padmasambhava made vows to help protect the Dharma and help practitioners. And they live a long time. They're not humans. They live for, according to Buddhism, they live for thousands or millions of years. So according to Buddhism, then what they say is that some of those non-human spirit beings who live in, who are associated with Padmasambhava or Milarepa or other great, who took vows and took teachings from those teachers, are still alive. And according to Buddhism, according to the Tibetan tradition, rather, there are people who have connections to them who they can then kind of, what's the word? I think there are certain Tibetan people who will invite those spirits to kind of enter them and talk, to give advice to the Dalai Lama or other lamas. So like these are like spirit beings who have existed for thousands of years, and they'll so like someone, I guess certain people will sort of do a practice to invite one of those beings, one of those spirits, to kind of come and give the Dalai Lama advice. And those beings can see things that they have a different, I guess actually it's fun. I guess you could say they have a different perspective because they've lived for thousands of years, whereas we're short-lived beings.
Well, wouldn't she know better than we would then what we need to hear?
I don't know. Actually, the only reason I'm saying is I sent a letter to the person who's organizing her tour, and they wrote back, and I don't know her. So the person wrote back to me and said, she's more likely to accept your invitation if you ask for something specific.
Mm.
So that's all I know, because they wrote back to me and said that. So, but yeah, so she's somebody who invites. I don't know who she invites, and I don't know the details of it, but she's somebody who invites one of these sometime. I mean, she has her own wisdom, I think, but then sometimes she invites some other long-lived being into her, and they give advice to the Tibetan government or the Dalai Lama through her. I guess. And there's a famous like Nechung, the Nechung oracle. That's very famous. That's always, ever since the time of the fifth Dalai Lama all the way to now, there's an example of the Nechung oracle is one oracle, where there's a monk who invites the Nechung oracle, and there's always been one. When that monk dies, another monk takes his place, and it's part of Tibetan culture, where then like the Dalai Lama will consult with the Nechung oracle, and ever since the time of the fifth Dalai Lama, he's like advised the Dalai Lamas about things. I don't know what, but and other lamas too. So there are many, and there are other oracles. I don't know them all. I don't know that much about them, to be honest. But where they'll ask questions, and and if you read any like great lama, like not like great. There are great lamas who don't do this, but like all the great Tibetan lamas who have a lot of like responsibility in Tibetan culture, like the Dalai Lamas are great. Sort of, what's the word? People who, a lama who just goes off and meditates doesn't have to deal. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with oracles, but lamas who have a lot of responsibility as part of Tibetan culture is that they'll sort of have these relationships to certain. I guess like Nechung is one who, for many centuries, I guess, has had a connection to the Dalai Lama or something. But yeah, exactly. Yeah, and sometimes one of the oracles advised the Dalai Lama when to leave, and there are many stories like that of like oracles who will sort of will give advice about something that prevents a catastrophe or something like that. But anyway, I don't personally have a lot of experience on it. It's just the things I've read. But we went over, so we should do the dedication. And I just sent out an email. I don't know if you all got it, but I just sent out an email that I'm sure Gabe will post soon to the website with classes for March and April. And I said, I don't know, we'll sort of see then. I'm pretty sure we'll need 2 classes in March and 2 in April. And then I don't know if we may finish then, or we may need another class or 2. So we'll see. So at least we'll have these classes through March and April, and then we'll sort of see if we need more classes if we're done then. But and thanks for the note. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it rise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Thanks, everybody. Good to see y'all.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren.
Appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Lauren. So
Okay.
helpful.
Good.
Thank you.